Understand what happened in November 1976. You have to understand what Rhodesia was in November 1976. A landlocked country of 6 million people, 270,000 of them white, and of those, roughly 40,000 under arms in any given month, spread across a security force that was fighting a war on borders longer than the entire eastern seaboard of the United States. On the western frontier, Zambia. Home to Joshua Nkomo's ZIPRA guerrillas, backed by Soviet advisors and Cuban instructors. On the eastern frontier, Mozambique, newly independent under Samora Machel, and more dangerous by the month. Because when Portugal collapsed in 1975, and Machel's Frelimo took power in Maputo, the entire 1,300-kilometer Rhodesian eastern border stopped being a hostile neutral zone and became an active operating base for Robert Mugabe's ZANLA insurgents. Frelimo gave them camps, training facilities, Chinese instructors, Soviet weapons, and a sanctuary the Rhodesian army was, under international law, forbidden to touch. By late 1976, ZANLA infiltration into Rhodesia's eastern districts had exploded. Farms were burning, schools were being attacked, the war was no longer contained, and Combined Operations Headquarters in Salisbury had a decision to make. Do you sit behind your own border and take the punishment, or do you cross it? The man in the chair was Lieutenant General Peter Walls, Commander, Combined Operations, 60 years old, Sandhurst trained, veteran of the Malayan emergency. And he had watched what happened to the British in Malaya when they stayed passive on their frontier. He was not going to make the same mistake, but here is what the history books leave out. The Rhodesian Air Force in November 1976 had less than 50 operational combat aircraft. The Army had no strategic reserve, and the political leadership in Salisbury was one bad week away from the collapse of white rule. Walls needed a raid that would hurt Frelimo so badly they would think twice about hosting ZANLA. He needed it done cheap, and he needed it done fast. The order he signed was called Operation Marden. The plan on Wall's desk was, by any measure of conventional warfare, insane. Send approximately 500 Rhodesian soldiers, a battalion group drawn from the Rhodesian Light Infantry, the Rhodesian African Rifles, and small teams from C Squadron SAS and the Sela Scouts across an international border. Have them attack 10 identified Frelimo and ZANLA bases spread across a 40-kilometer deep strip of enemy territory in the Espungabura and Chimyo sectors. Do it in 8 days. Return before the Mozambican Army's mechanized brigades in Beira could react. The estimated enemy strength across those bases, over 1,000 fighters. In some places up to 2,000 when you counted the transient ZANLA cadres in transit. Dug in, wire perimeters, trenches, 82mm mortars, 14.5mm heavy machine guns. In several cases, 122mm rockets zeroed in on suspected Rhodesian approach routes. The Rhodesian troops would have no armor, limited artillery, and a total air component of at most 12 Alouette III helicopters, a handful of Dakotas for paratroop drops, and Hawker Hunters for close support. Each aircraft flying 2, 3, sometimes 4 sorties a day out of forward airfields at Chipinge and Grand Reef. The senior planner was Brigadier David Heppenstall, commanding 2 Brigade at Umtali. The tactical commander in the field was going to be running Fire Force operations on a scale nobody in Africa had ever attempted. If it is landing so far, save this video, because what happens next is one of the least taught master classes in small unit warfare of the entire 20th century. You will want to come back to this one, because here is the turning point. Every conventional military doctrine in 1976 said the same thing. If you attack a fortified enemy who outnumbers you, you concentrate your force, you mass, you hit one target with everything you have, then you consolidate and move on. Walls, Heppenstall, and the Rhodesian planners did the exact opposite. They dispersed. They ordered simultaneous, multi-axis, small unit strikes, 60-man Fire Force packages, 30-man SAS call-sends, 12-man Sela Scouts teams, hitting different bases across the entire 40-kilometer front at the same time on the same morning. The reasoning was cold. Frelimo's command was in Maputo. Their reaction was going to be centralized, slow, and confused. If the Rhodesians hit 10 places at once, Frelimo would not know which one was the main attack. They would freeze. They would try to reinforce everywhere. They would reinforce nowhere. At 06:30 on 1 November 1976, Hawker Hunters of 1 squadron went in first. Golf bombs, Rhodesian-designed cluster munitions, walked across the identified enemy trench lines. Behind them, Dakotas of 3 Squadron dropped RLI paratroopers directly onto assembly areas that intelligence said were still full of sleeping ZANLA recruits. Alouettes came in behind, offloading Fire Force sticks onto the escape routes. K-car gunships circled above with 20mm cannons, cutting down anyone who broke into the open. The first day, 5 bases fell inside 3 hours. Frelimo's response was exactly what Walls had predicted: total paralysis. Radio traffic from Maputo, intercepted by Rhodesian signals, showed contradictory orders being issued to units that no longer existed. A Mozambican mechanized column that started rolling out of Chimyo was hit by hunters on the road and turned back before it had covered 30 kilometers. By nightfall on day 1, over 100 enemy dead were counted. Rhodesian casualties, 1 killed. But that was only the opening move. What happened next defied every rule of warfare. The Rhodesian battalion did not withdraw. That was the second decision that should have been impossible. Every raid doctrine, American, British, Israeli, said that once you have surprise, you hit, you extract, you go home. You do not sit in enemy territory. Rhodesian planners rewrote the rule. They stayed for 8 days. For 8 days, small units of RLI, RAR, SAS, and Sela scouts moved through the Manica bush on foot, hitting secondary targets that intelligence had not even confirmed until the raid was underway. Vehicle parks, ammunition dumps, radio relay stations. ZANLA training school that the intelligence branch had been trying to locate for a year and a half. Captured documents, later analyzed at the Rhodesian Joint Services Photographic Intelligence Center, would show that Marden destroyed enough weapons and munitions to have equipped over 3,000 ZANLA infiltrators. Rice stockpiles for 6 months of guerrilla operations went up in smoke. Fuel dumps burned so hot the smoke was reported by commercial airliners flying over Mozambique. And through it all, the Rhodesian casualty count stayed almost impossibly low. By the end of Marden on 8 November 1976, the confirmed enemy dead, Frelimo and ZANLA combined, stood at over 300, with total credible estimates from captured documents suggesting the real figure was closer to 400 to 500. Wounded, likely double that. 10 major bases destroyed or rendered unusable. 2 Mozambican army positions overrun. Rhodesian dead, under 10. The ratio was not the point. The ratio was a symptom. The point was this: 500 Rhodesian soldiers operating in a country whose combined military and paramilitary strength was measured in the hundreds of thousands, had spent 8 days walking through enemy territory. And Frelimo's regular army, Soviet-equipped, Cuban-advised, had been unable to bring them to battle even once. That was the psychological hammer blow. And it detonated in every capital in southern Africa. Because if Frelimo could not protect its own bases, 100 kilometers inside its own border, from a Rhodesian battalion group, what was Mashal's promise of sanctuary to ZANLA actually worth? The answer, as the next 12 months would prove, was almost nothing. Operation Marden did not win the Rhodesian Bush War. Nothing was going to win the Rhodesian Bush War for the Rhodesians. The demographics, the sanctions, the diplomatic isolation were unbeatable. Rhodesia would cease to exist as a state within 4 years. But Marden changed what was militarily possible in that war. Before November 1976, Rhodesian doctrine treated the border as a hard limit. After Marden, the border became a suggestion. Over the following 3 years, the Rhodesians would launch progressively larger external raids. Operation Dingo against Chimyo and Tembu in November 1977, killing over 3,000 ZANLA cadres in a single week. Operation Uric, Operation Miracle, Operation Bastille, each one built on the tactical grammar that Marden had proved. Concentric multi-axis air-land assault, dispersed simultaneous attacks, extended in-country operations by small units. Vertical envelopment by heli-borne fire force. And here is what the history books leave out about the wider impact. The Israeli Defense Forces studied Marden. So did the South Africans in far more detail. The tactical model was absorbed directly into SADF cross-border doctrine and applied in Angola in operations like Reindeer and Skeptic throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s. The American Special Operations community quietly sent observers. The Fire Force concept, heli-borne Alouette III sticks working with paratroopers and fixed-wing close support, became a template studied at Fort Bragg, at Hereford, at the Sayeret Matkal School. When the British ran external counterinsurgency doctrine reviews after the Falklands, Rhodesian veterans were quietly consulted. The country that produced these tactics disappeared into the history books in 1980. The doctrine did not. And the final decision, the one historians still argue about, is this: was Marden a strategic success or a strategic mistake? Because there is a case, made most sharply by scholars like J.R.T. Wood, that every external operation Rhodesia launched after Marden, everyone pushed Frelimo and ZANLA closer together, hardened the frontline states against Salisbury, and made the international pressure for a settlement more overwhelming, not less. Tactically, Rhodesia was winning every fight. Strategically, every victory cost them a little more of the war. Drop it in the comments. Was Marden Rhodesia's finest hour or the beginning of the end? Which side do you think read the strategic picture better, Walls in Salisbury or Mashal in Maputo? CTA 1213 Min. If you want more of these, the raids that rewrote doctrine, the small unit actions from the wars nobody teaches, from the Rhodesian SAS to the Gurkhas, from Peleliu to Ain Jalut, subscribe and hit the bell icon. New battle every Wednesday. This channel exists because of viewers who understand that the biggest history is not always fought by the biggest armies. Outro 1315 Min. 500 men. 8 days. 1,000 enemy troops trained by Soviet and Cuban officers dug into their own territory, unable to stop a battalion group operating without armor, without a strategic reserve, without a friend in the world. Operation Marden is the quiet answer to a question most military historians never quite finish asking. What does an army do when it knows it is going to lose the war, and it fights on anyway? It writes a doctrine that outlives the country that wrote it. It teaches the next generation of soldiers, in Tel Aviv, in Pretoria, in Fort Bragg, how a small force can dominate a large one if it moves faster than command can react. The lesson of Marden is not that Rhodesia won. It is that professional violence applied with imagination can rearrange a war for 1 week, 1 month, 1 year, long enough to matter. And sometimes that is all military history preserves, not the victors, the moments. If this one hit, my video on Operation Dingo, the Chim-O and Tembu raids of November 1977, where Rhodesian paratroopers killed over 3,000 insurgents in a single afternoon, will blow your mind. That is where the Marden Doctrine reached its full and terrible maturity. I will see you there. In November 1976, roughly 500 Rhodesian soldiers crossed into Mozambique to attack 10 fortified Frelimo and ZANLA bases defended by more than 1,000 entrenched enemy troops. Over 8 days, Operation Marden rewrote the doctrine of cross-border warfare and would be studied for decades afterwards by the Israeli Defense Forces, the South African Defense Force, and Western Special Operations communities. This is the story of the order signed by Lieutenant General Peter Walls at Combined Operations Headquarters in Salisbury. The tactical planning by Brigadier David Heppenstall's 2 Brigade in Umtali. The Rhodesian Light Infantry Paratroop Drops, the SAS Colsons, the Cella Scout Small Teams, and the Alouette III Fire Force Sticks that turned a numerically inferior raiding force into a decisive strategic hammer inside enemy territory. We cover the strategic setup, the turning point decision to disperse rather than concentrate, the 8 days of in-country operations, and the argument historians still have today about whether Marden was Rhodesia's finest tactical hour, or the strategic beginning of the end. Timestamps: 0000, the Hook 00, 30 Rhodesia in November 1976, 03, 00 the order that should have been suicidal, 06, 008 days that broke a sanctuary, 09, 00 the doctrine that outlived the country, 12, 00 subscribed, 13, 00 the lasting legacy.